By the time the third pickup slowed down on Whitmore Road, Clara Whitmore was already standing knee-deep in the east field, with mud up to the hem of her jeans and a wooden crate in both hands. The field around her looked ruined. Brown water covered the low ground from the old sycamore tree to the leaning fence line. The April rain had turned the soil into a shining sheet of mud, and last year's soybean stalks lay half-rotted beneath the surface like bones under dirty glass. The drainage ditch along the road had overflowed 2 nights earlier, and every farmer within 5 miles had been pumping water off their land, praying the roots had not drowned. Clara was doing the opposite. She opened the crate and tipped it gently toward the water. A rush of white, brown, and speckled ducks tumbled out into the flooded field, flapping, splashing, and calling into the wet morning. They scattered across the shallow water as if they had been waiting their whole lives for that ugly patch of ruined ground. Another crate waited behind her, then another. By noon, 180 ducks were moving through the east field of Whitmore Farm, cutting little wakes through the muddy water, while Clara stood among them, with her braids stuck to the back of her damp shirt. Across the fence, Earl Benson leaned against the hood of his red Ford, with his arms folded. He owned the corn ground north of Clara's place, and had been waiting for years to buy the Whitmore East field for almost nothing. Beside him, 2 older men from the feed store watched with the quiet pleasure of people witnessing a mistake big enough to become town gossip. On the road, another truck rolled by slowly, its tires hissing through the wet gravel. A woman in the passenger seat turned her head and stared until the truck disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Clara did not wave. She did not explain. She only lowered another crate, opened the latch, and watched more ducks spill into the brown water. The sound of them filled the hollow field, soft bodies moving through mud, bills dipping beneath the surface, webbed feet stirring what every neighbor had called dead ground. To anyone passing by, it looked like a young woman throwing away the last of her money on birds that belonged in a pond, not on a farm already drowning in debt. The east field had always been the embarrassment of Whitmore Farm. It held water when the rest of the county dried out. It soured after long rains. It swallowed tractor tires. Every spring, it grew more sedge, dockweed, smartweed, and mosquito grass than anything worth harvesting. Clara's father had tried to drain it. Her grandfather had tried to plow it. Every man who ever looked at it had called it stubborn. Now Clara was standing in the middle of it, not with a pump, not with seed bags, not with a load of lime or fertilizer, but with ducks. By late afternoon, the rumor had already reached Miller's Feed and Grain, the county diner, and the local bank. The Whitmore girl had finally lost her sense. She had taken a flooded field and turned it into a duck pond. The worst part, at least to everyone watching, was how calm she looked while doing it. She did not look desperate. She did not look embarrassed. She moved slowly, checked the fence line, counted the birds, drove stakes into the mud, and tied orange ribbons where the water ran deepest. When one duck got tangled in a patch of dead grass, she waded over, freed it, and placed it back into the water with the same care another farmer might give to a newborn calf. A cold wind came across the field near sunset. The ducks gathered near a floating shelter Clara had built from old pallets, blue barrels, and tin scraps pulled from the broken machine shed. Their bodies made soft ripples in the water. Behind them, the farmhouse sat on the rise, white paint peeling from the porch posts, kitchen window glowing faintly in the gray light. Clara looked from the ducks to the field and then to the road, where Earl Benson's truck still sat like a warning. She knew what they saw. They saw mud. They saw debt. They saw a girl too young to know when land was lost. They did not see what she had seen in her grandfather's notebook. They did not smell what she had smelled beneath the sour top layer of that soil. They did not know what lived under the water after a hard rain, or what ducks could turn into money if a person stopped fighting the land long enough to listen. Clara Whitmore was 24 years old when she took over the farm that had raised 3 generations of her family. Her grandfather, Amos Whitmore, had bought the first 40 acres after coming home from a factory job he hated. He had cleared brush with a mule, built the first barn with neighbors from the church, and planted corn on ground that people said was too wet and too poor to amount to much. In good years, Whitmore Farm fed cattle, grew soybeans, sold hay, and kept enough hens to pay for coffee, flour, and school shoes. In bad years, it survived, because nobody in the family expected farming to be easy. Clara's father, Daniel, had been the last strong back on the place. He knew the sound of every engine, every gate hinge, every rain cloud over the ridge. But 2 winters before the ducks came, he suffered a stroke while repairing a frozen water line behind the barn. He lived, but the right side of his body never fully returned to him. His voice became slow. His hands shook when he tried to button his shirt. The man who had once lifted feed sacks like they were pillows now sat on the porch and watched his daughter do work he could no longer finish. Clara had been working at a veterinary supply warehouse 30 miles away when it happened. She came home for what was supposed to be a few weeks. Then the bills arrived. Then spring came. Then the bank called. By summer, she had quit her job, moved back into her childhood bedroom, and started waking before daylight to keep Whitmore Farm from sliding into foreclosure. The place was in worse condition than anyone admitted out loud. The tractor was a 30-year-old International with a cracked seat, a leaking hydraulic hose, and a starter that failed whenever the weather turned damp. The barn roof had 3 panels loose, and rain came through in silver threads during storms. The south fence leaned like tired men at the end of a long day. The west pasture was thin, the hayfield patchy, and the east field held water so often that even the banker had stopped counting it as productive ground. The year before Clara brought in the ducks, Whitmore Farm had planted soybeans late after a wet spring. Then came more rain. Then root rot. Then weeds. The crop came up uneven, yellowed, and weak. By harvest, the yield was so poor the elevator ticket looked like an insult. Fertilizer bills remained. Fuel bills remained. Equipment repairs remained. The note at Pike County Bank remained. Harlan Pike, the bank manager, was not cruel in the obvious ways. He did not shout. He did not pound the desk. He wore pressed shirts, kept a framed picture of his grandchildren near the teller window, and spoke softly when he explained hard numbers. That almost made it worse. Each time Clara sat across from him, the farm seemed to shrink into columns of debt, interest, and risk. In March, he gave her 90 days to show that Whitmore Farm had a real path forward. Not hope, not family pride, not old stories about better years. A plan. Clara left the bank that day with a folder under her arm and the weight of 3 generations pressing between her shoulder blades. Outside, the courthouse clock chimed over Main Street. At the diner, farmers were eating meatloaf and talking about seed prices. At the feed store, Earl Benson was buying mineral blocks and telling anyone who listened that the Whitmore girl ought to sell before the bank sold for her. Clara heard enough to know what the county thought. They thought she was too quiet, too bookish, too young, too stubborn. They thought she had come home out of guilt and stayed out of pride. They thought farming was a language spoken by men with scarred hands and gray hair, not by a young woman who carried a notebook in the back pocket of her jeans and studied mud like it had something to say. They were wrong about why she stayed. Clara did not stay because she believed the farm would magically recover. She stayed because every fence post, every field road, every rain barrel under the eaves carried the fingerprints of the people who had loved that land before her. Her grandfather had died at the kitchen table with seed catalogs stacked beside him. Her father sat each evening on the porch, looking over fields he could no longer walk, and her mother had never left the farm in the ways that mattered. Evelyn Whitmore had died when Clara was 16, on a cold January morning that made the farmhouse feel too large for the 3 people left inside it. For years afterward, her absence lived in ordinary places: the empty hook by the back door where her garden hat had hung, the chipped blue bowl she used for biscuit dough, the faint smell of lavender in a cedar drawer Clara could never bring herself to clean out. But every March, before the fields were ready, and before the county began judging who had planted early and who had fallen behind, her mother returned in yellow. Daffodils rose along the lane. They came up under the mailbox, beside the cattle guard, around the old white fence posts, and in a bright, uneven line, leading from Whitmore Road to the porch steps. Clara's mother had planted them one fall, with a hand trowel and a coffee can full of bulbs, working down the lane, while Clara followed behind her in rubber boots. She had planted them in poor soil, under hard clay, beside gravel, in places Daniel said would never hold flowers. But they came back every year. They did not ask if the farm was profitable. They did not care if the bank was calling. They pushed through cold ground before anything else dared to show color. During the spring of the ducks, Clara noticed them more than usual. On the morning she brought the first crates home, the daffodils were nearly spent, their yellow heads bent by rain. The trucks slowed on the road, neighbors stared, and Clara carried the birds past those fading flowers toward the flooded field. For one sharp moment, she remembered her mother kneeling in the lane, pressing bulbs into stubborn earth with muddy fingers and a quiet certainty that looked foolish until spring proved it right. Her grandfather had left the map. Her father had left the knowledge of machinery, weather, and water. But her mother had left something Clara needed just as badly: the belief that small buried things could survive a season when nobody saw them working. Selling would have paid the debt. It would have ended the calls, the repairs, the slow humiliation of being watched by people waiting for her to fail. But selling would also have ended Whitmore Farm. So Clara went looking for a way to save the part of the farm everyone else had given up on. The laughter began the same day the ducks arrived, and by the end of the week it had settled over town like dust after harvest. At Miller's Feed and Grain, men leaned against sacks of starter feed and shook their heads when Clara's name came up. They talked about drainage tile, lime, and diesel pumps. They talked about common sense. They talked about her father as if he were already gone and unable to be hurt by the comparison. They remembered Daniel Whitmore as a practical man and Clara as a girl with ideas from notebooks. At the diner, the waitress stopped refilling coffee whenever someone mentioned the duck field because the table near the window always got loud after that. Farmers who had battled mud their whole lives enjoyed the absurdity of someone inviting birds into it. The story grew as it traveled. By Thursday, some said Clara had bought 200 ducks. By Saturday, someone claimed she was planning to stock fish next and charge admission. Clara heard pieces of it everywhere. At the gas pump, a man looked toward her muddy boots and smiled like he knew the ending already. At the parts counter, two brothers went silent when she walked in for hose clamps. On Sunday, outside the little white church, an elderly woman touched Clara's arm with pity and told her not to work herself sick over land that might not be meant to stay in the family. Clara thanked her and went home. She never argued. That confused people more than anger would have. If she had shouted, they could have called her emotional. If she had explained too much, they could have picked her plan apart before it had roots. Instead, she went silent and kept working. She drove cedar posts along the edge of the flooded field and strung electric netting to keep out stray dogs and coyotes. She built 2 floating shelters from scrap lumber and plastic barrels, anchoring them with ropes tied to iron stakes. She cleared a narrow path from the barn to the water so she could haul feed without sinking to her knees. She cut old tin into panels for shade, patched a rain barrel, and set up nesting boxes beneath the lean-to where the ground stayed dry. The ducks seemed to understand the field faster than anyone else did. They moved in groups through the shallow water, bills sweeping side to side, pulling at larvae, tender weeds, snails, beetles, and seeds. They nosed through the matted soybean residue and churned the top layer of mud, just enough to keep it from sealing over. At first, Clara only watched. Then she began to measure. She marked the water level each morning on a wooden stake. She pressed soil between her fingers and wrote down whether it smelled sour, metallic, grassy, or clean. She counted eggs once the first hens began laying. She tracked where the ducks spent the longest time and where the weed pressure changed. She noted how the water near the shelters clouded after feeding and cleared by the next day. She wrote down the date earthworms appeared along the drier edge of the field. The county agent, Martin Alvarez came by after Harlan Pike mentioned the ducks during a bank luncheon. Martin was kind, careful, and educated enough to be skeptical without being insulting. He stood near the fence with a clipboard while Clara explained only the surface of what she was doing. Wet ground, ducks, eggs, weed control, possible compost. He advised soil tests, a drainage plan, and caution. He reminded her that waterlogged soils could turn sour if mishandled, that disease could spread fast in poultry, and that a farm under debt needed reliable income, not experiments. Clara nodded, wrote down what he said, and thanked him. Then she went back to the field. Earl Benson watched more often than anyone. He pretended he was checking his own fence or counting cattle across the road, but Clara knew he was studying her failure the way a buyer studies a cracked machine at auction. He had offered once to take the east field off her hands. The price had been so low that even Harlan Pike looked embarrassed when it came up. After the ducks arrived, Earl seemed more confident. A flooded field full of birds made Clara look less like a farmer and more like someone giving the bank a reason to act. But the more people laughed, the more Clara studied the mud. The idea had not begun with ducks. It had begun with a map drawn in pencil by a man who had been dead for 12 years. Clara found it in the old machine shed, inside a warped wooden box beneath a stack of rusted cultivator teeth. The box had belonged to her grandfather, Amos Whitmore. Inside were seed tags, old rain records, a brass pocket knife with a cracked handle, and 3 notebooks tied together with baling twine. The pages smelled like dust, oil, and dry tobacco. Some of the ink had faded to brown. Some of the pencil marks had been pressed so hard into the paper that Clara could still feel them with her fingertips. Most of the entries looked ordinary at first. Rainfall, calving dates, corn yields, fence repairs, frost warnings. Then she reached the back of the second notebook and found a folded sheet of graph paper. It was a hand-drawn map of Whitmore Farm, but not the kind of map a banker would understand. There were no property values, no crop zones, no neat rectangles of productive and unproductive land. Amos had drawn arrows showing where water moved after a hard rain. He had marked the places where silt gathered, where cattails used to grow, where wild ducks landed in March, where the soil stayed black under the mud instead of turning gray and sour. At the bottom of the page, he had written one sentence in block letters. "The East Hollow is not a failed field. It is a slow water field." Clara read the sentence 3 times. Below it, Amos had made a table with 3 columns. What the water brings, what the birds take, what the mud gives back. Under the first column, he had listed silt, weed seed, beetle larvae, drowned grass, and creek wash. Under the second, he had written, ducks eat snails before they eat leaves. Ducks hunt mosquito wigglers. Ducks stir but do not tear. Ducks leave fertility where they sleep. Under the third, he had written black muck for garden, bedding compost, green edge growth, less sour smell after moving birds. It was not a fantasy, it was a system. There were small experiments scattered through the pages. In 1978, Amos had let 23 ducks into the flooded corner after a spring storm and noted that the smartweed thinned along the fence. In 1981, he had spread 2 wagon loads of muck from the hollow under tomato rows and written that the leaves turned dark as tobacco by June. In 1984, after a flood took half the county's bottomland corn, he had written that water only destroys when a farmer gives it nowhere to slow down. One page carried a rough drawing that stopped Clara cold. On the left side, Amos had drawn a straight drainage ditch with water rushing out of the farm. Beside it, he had written money leaving with water. On the right side, he had drawn a shallow wet field with ducks, reeds, compost piles, and garden beds. Beside that, he had written water becoming eggs, fertility, and soil. Clara sat on an overturned bucket in the machine shed with the notebook open on her lap and rain tapping the tin roof above her. For the first time since the bank had started calling, she did not look at the east field as a wound on the farm. She looked at it as a machine her family had forgotten how to run. Her father had spent years trying to make that hollow behave like dry ground. He drained, plowed, sprayed, planted, and cursed it. Maybe he had never seen this page. Maybe he had seen it and ignored it, because the county had taught every farmer the same lesson. Wet land was wasted land, unless it could be forced dry. But Amos had seen something different. He had seen that the hollow was not empty. It was collecting value. It gathered water, silt, larvae, weed seeds, soft plants, and organic matter from the rest of the farm. Every storm delivered raw material. Every flood brought a kind of harvest no combine could gather. Clara stayed in the shed until the light went dim and the rain turned the doorway silver. Then she tore a blank page from her own notebook and copied Amos's 3 columns. What the water brings, what the birds take, what the mud gives back. That was the real beginning of the duck field, not desperation. Translation. Her father understood more than people thought. After the stroke, Daniel Whitmore's words came slowly, and some days they did not come at all. His right hand curled inward when he was tired. His walk had become a careful negotiation between his body and the floor. People in town lowered their voices around him, as if a damaged body meant a dimmed mind. Clara knew better. Every evening, after she finished counting eggs and checking fences, she brought her notebook to the porch and sat beside him. She did not ask him for approval. She read the numbers aloud, because numbers had always been his language. Egg count, feed cost, water depth, birds lost, birds gained, compost temperature, diner order, bakery order, rainfall. Daniel listened with his eyes fixed on the east field. Sometimes he lifted one finger when she skipped a cost. Sometimes he tapped the arm of his chair when a number did not make sense. Once, when Clara said the ducks had spent most of the day near the shallow north edge, he dragged his left hand across the porch table and pointed to the old farm map. His finger landed exactly where the ground dipped toward the creek. Clara had missed it. The water was not simply sitting there, it was feeding into the hollow through a thin cut under the grass, an old wash Amos had marked decades earlier. Daniel could not explain it in full sentences, but he did not need to. His finger on the map told her what his mouth could not. The next morning, Clara walked the field and found the hidden flow under a mat of sedge. She widened it by hand, not enough to drain the field, only enough to guide the water. After that, the sour smell faded faster after storms. That evening, she placed a small stone on the porch table beside the map. It was her way of marking the place he had helped her find. Daniel looked at it for a long time. Then he covered it with his weak hand. From then on, the duck field belonged to both of them. The county saw Clara alone in the mud and thought she was carrying the farm by herself. They did not see the old farmer on the porch, reading water through his daughter's notebook. They did not see Clara bringing him cracked eggshells, soil crumbs, and damp pages so he could study what his body could no longer walk to. They did not see the way he stayed awake until her boots hit the porch each night. The first eggs came in late April. They were larger than chicken eggs, with strong shells and deep orange yolks. Clara cracked one into a skillet before dawn and watched it sit thick and bright in the pan. The smell filled the kitchen. Her father sat at the table with his left hand around a coffee mug, watching her with tired eyes that still held the old sharpness. She placed the egg in front of him with toast and did not say what she hoped. He ate slowly. Then he looked toward the window, where the east field shone silver under morning fog. His left hand moved across the table, searching until it found her notebook. With one finger, he tapped the empty column where she had written income. It was not a compliment. It was a farmer asking for the next number. Clara smiled for the first time in days. She took the first dozen duck eggs to the diner in a reused carton with a handwritten label. The owner, Marlene, bought them more out of sympathy than confidence. 3 days later, she asked for 2 dozen more. A week after that, the bakery in town wanted to try them for cakes and custards. The yolks made dough richer. The shells held up during transport. Customers noticed without knowing why. It was not enough to save the farm, not yet. But it was the first money the Eastfield had made in years. Spring turned hard after that. The rain stopped for 9 days, then returned in violent bursts. The water rose and fell. Mosquitoes came thick near the tree line until the ducks found the larvae. A fox took 6 birds in one night before Clara reinforced the netting with old cattle panels. Another storm tore loose one floating shelter and shoved it against the fence, bending 2 posts. Clara spent half a day in cold rain dragging it back, hands numb, boots suctioning deep in the mud. The tractor failed twice in May. The second time, it died while she was hauling straw bales toward the duck shelters. She sat on the fender with grease on her cheek, listening to the engine click uselessly. Behind her, thunderheads built over the ridge. Ahead of her, the field waited, full of birds depending on her and water that could shift from blessing to disaster in one night. She fixed the starter with parts scavenged from an old machine behind the shed. Money thinned until every purchase hurt. Feed cost more than she had expected. Netting cost more. Bedding cost more. Fuel cost more. The bank statements came in clean white envelopes that looked almost insulting against the muddy kitchen table. At night, after her father went to bed, Clara spread the bills beside her notebooks. The numbers did not care about hope. They did not care that the ducks were laying better. They did not care that the weeds were thinning or that the mud smelled less sour near the shelters. They only showed what was due. One night in early June, rain hammered the tin roof so hard it drowned out the clock. Water ran through a leak near the stove and dripped into a pot Clara had set beneath it. Her hands were swollen from work. Her boots stood by the door, crusted with mud. On the table lay a notice from Pike County Bank reminding her that her review date was approaching. For the first time, Clara let herself imagine leaving. She imagined auction signs at the road. Earl Benson walking the Eastfield with a banker. Her father's chair gone from the porch. Her grandfather's note boxed in a storage unit somewhere, their pages no longer tied to land that remembered them. Her mother's daffodils blooming for strangers who would never know whose hands had buried them. The thought made her chest ache so sharply she had to stand. She went outside in the rain without a coat and walked to the edge of the east field. The ducks were sheltered, murmuring beneath the tin roofs. Water trembled under the storm. Lightning lit the field in white flashes, showing the orange ribbons, the stakes, the floating houses, the low water channels she had cut by hand. It still looked foolish. It also looked alive. When she returned to the kitchen, Daniel was awake. He could not comfort her with speeches. He could not promise that the farm would survive. But while rain beat against the windows and Clara sat with her head in both hands, he pushed Amos's notebook across the table with his left hand. The notebook stopped against her elbow. On the open page was the old drawing of the 2 systems, the ditch that sent water and money away, and the wet field that turned water into eggs, fertility, and soil. Daniel pressed one finger on the second drawing. Then he pressed the same finger against Clara's notebook. It was not a command. It was not encouragement in the easy sense. It was a transfer of trust. By dawn, she had made a new list. She would cut feed costs by moving the ducks in tighter rotations through the richest weed patches. She would collect bedding from the shelters more often and compost it with straw and muck from the field edge. She would plant a small test bed behind the barn, using that compost, and compare it with purchased fertilizer. She would ask Marlene at the diner for a weekly standing order instead of occasional sales. She would drive to the next town and speak to the bakery owner face to face. She did all of it. The test bed behind the barn changed first. Clara planted kale, squash, and tomatoes in 3 rows. 1 row got store-bought fertilizer. 1 got nothing. 1 got composted duck bedding and dark mud from the field edge. Within 4 weeks, the compost row stood deeper green, leaves wide and glossy, soil holding moisture without turning slick. Martin Alvarez returned and crouched beside the bed for a long time. He crumbled the soil in his palm and smelled it. His expression did not become praise, not yet, but it changed from polite concern to attention. The ducks kept working. Where they moved often, The smartweed thinned. Snails disappeared from the shallows. Mosquito pressure dropped near the barn. The field edge grew greener, but not rank and sour like before. The water flowed more slowly through Clara's shallow channels, spreading instead of cutting. When she pulled a spade from the mud, the underside no longer smelled rotten, it smelled earthy. Then the storms came that proved everything. In the last week of June, a stalled weather system settled over the county and emptied itself for 4 straight days. Rain fell until ditches became streams, and streams became brown ropes of water tearing through culverts. The sky stayed low and bruised. Thunder rolled at night without pause. Fields that had looked promising on Monday looked drowned by Thursday. Farmers ran pumps until motors burned out. Young corn yellowed in standing water. Soybean rows vanished beneath sheets of runoff. Fertilizer washed into road ditches. On the Benson place, a drainage cut broke open and sent water roaring across a planted field, taking seed, silt, and hope with it. Whitmore Farm took water too, but the east field did what it had always wanted to do. It caught it. Water spread across the hollow, slowed by sedge, old residue, Clara's low berms, and the channels she had shaped by hand. Instead of rushing straight to the creek and ripping soil away, it widened and settled. The ducks moved across it, as if the storm had delivered a feast. They fed on insects flushed from the ground, larvae rising in the shallows, and tender growth torn loose by the rain. The west side of Whitmore Farm suffered some damage, but less than Clara feared. The garden behind the barn held, the compost rows stood firm, the duck shelters stayed anchored, the fence leaned but did not fail. On the 5th morning, the rain stopped. A strange silence followed. The county seemed to hold its breath under a washed, clean sky. Clara walked the farm before sunrise, counting birds, checking posts, reading the watermarks. Her legs shook from exhaustion. Her eyes burned. But when she reached the rise above the east field, she stopped. The field was not ruined. It was full. Full of water, yes. Full of birds. Full of floating weed seeds being eaten, insects being cleared, manure being spread, silt being caught, and life moving through a place everyone else had written off. Across the road, Earl Benson stood in his damaged cornfield with mud to his ankles. He did not wave, he only stared. That afternoon, Harlan Pike called. Clara's review date had arrived. The bank needed proof of income and a credible plan before the end of the week. His tone was careful, but the meaning was clear. Without numbers, the bank would begin the process that everyone in town had been expecting. For 2 nights, Clara prepared her case at the kitchen table. She gathered diner receipts, bakery orders, egg counts, feed costs, compost trials, photographs of the field before and after the storm, and notes from Martin Alvarez showing reduced erosion and improved organic matter in her test beds. She included the small but growing list of customers who wanted duck eggs weekly. She included a letter from the bakery owner stating that she would take every dozen Clara could provide through the summer. She included projections for compost sales, seasonal meat birds, and expanded vegetable production using duck-based fertility. Daniel stayed beside her both nights. He could not write cleanly anymore, but he could still catch a missing number. When Clara forgot to subtract the cost of netting from her first month's income, he tapped the receipt with one finger until she saw it. When she nearly left out the value of fertilizer she did not have to buy for the garden rows, he pushed the old bill toward her. When her hands shook too badly to draw the final diagram straight, he held the ruler down with his left hand. Near midnight, Clara took out one of her mother's old blue plates from the cupboard and set it in the middle of the table. She did not know why at first. Then she placed 3 things around it: Amos's notebook, Daniel's farm map, and a dry daffodil head she had saved from the lane in April without thinking. It looked strange there among bank statements and invoices, but it steadied her. The next morning, when Clara walked into Pike County Bank, she did not feel like a customer. She felt like a defendant. The conference room was colder than Harlan Pike's office and twice as bright. Fluorescent lights hummed above a long polished table. On one side sat Harlan, with Clara's loan file in front of him, thick with payment history, late notices, crop reports, and risk summaries. Beside him sat a regional credit officer from Springfield, a woman with silver glasses and a clean legal pad. At the far end was a board member Clara recognized from the grain elevator, a man who had once told her father that wet ground was only good for frogs. They had not gathered to admire her experiment. They had gathered to decide whether Whitmore Farm was still worth carrying. Clara placed her folder on the table. It looked small against the bank's stack of documents. Her hands were steady, but only because she had pressed them flat against the folder before entering the room. Harlan began with the old numbers. The failed soybean crop, the equipment debt, the overdue fertilizer bill, the property note, the Eastfield's previous production history, the insurance gaps, the bank's exposure if another season failed. Each page made the farm sound less like land and more like a sinking account. The regional officer studied Clara without softness. She moved line by line through the file, asking for proof of recurring income, not one-time sales. She wanted margin after feed costs. She wanted mortality records. She wanted buyer commitments in writing. She wanted to know whether the duck field could survive disease, predators, drought, and another major rain event. She wanted to know why any bank should trust a poultry wetland system run by a 24-year-old borrower with no collateral left to offer, except the same land already under review. Clara did not defend herself with pride. She opened her folder. The first sheet showed egg production by week, not as a story but as a climb. The second showed feed costs dropping as the ducks consumed more forage in rotation. The third showed signed weekly orders from the diner and the bakery. The fourth showed a letter of intent from the restaurant 2 towns over for seasonal duck. The fifth showed compost pre-orders from local gardeners. The sixth showed the fertilizer bill she had not needed to renew for the garden rows behind the barn. Then Clara laid out the storm photographs. The room changed. On the left side of each page was a neighboring field after the flood. Cut channels, exposed roots, yellow seedlings, silt fans spread across road ditches. On the right side was the Whitmore East Hollow, full of water but intact, holding silt instead of losing it, ducks moving across the shallows, compost rows still green behind the barn. The board member from the grain elevator leaned forward despite himself. Clara turned to the final page. It was Amos Whitmore's model, redrawn in her own hand. 2 columns. The traditional model showed money leaving the farm, diesel for pumping, herbicide for weeds, fertilizer for depleted soil, reseeding after flood loss, loan extension after crop failure. The Whitmore model showed water entering the farm and splitting into income streams: duck eggs, seasonal meat, compost, vegetable fertility, weed control, insect reduction, erosion protection. At the bottom, Clara had written one number in dark pencil. The East Field had earned more net income in 10 weeks than it had earned in the previous 3 growing seasons combined. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the credit officer found the weak point. She pointed to the debt still outstanding, the old tractor, the barn roof, and the fact that Clara's model was still young. A good 10 weeks did not erase a bad balance sheet. A promising field did not remove risk. A bank could not restructure a loan because a borrower loved her grandfather's notes. Clara had expected that. She removed one last envelope from the back of the folder. Inside were 3 checks and 2 signed commitments. The diner had prepaid 1 month for eggs at a discount. The bakery had done the same. The restaurant had placed a deposit for fall birds. Martin Alvarez had written a county conservation support letter, not promising money, but confirming that Clara's system had reduced visible erosion and improved organic matter in trial beds. Marlene from the diner had added a handwritten note stating that Whitmore duck eggs had become her most requested breakfast ingredient. The checks were not large enough to save a careless farm, but they were large enough to prove the farm had stopped bleeding from its weakest place. Harlan Pike looked at the checks, then at the photographs, then at the model Clara had redrawn from Amos's notebook. The room that had been built to measure risk now had to measure something it did not usually see: a farmer changing the definition of value. The credit officer closed her pen. The board members stared at the flood photos. Harlan did not smile. He did not apologize. The bank did not become generous. It remained a bank. But the decision shifted. The note would be extended. The immediate payment schedule would be restructured. The East Field would no longer be listed in the file as non-productive ground. Clara would have to report monthly income and expenses through the end of the year. One missed benchmark could reopen the foreclosure process. It was not mercy. It was a narrow bridge. Clara accepted it because bridges were all farmers ever got. When she walked out of the bank, she carried no victory speech with her, only stamped papers, a new deadline, and the knowledge that the mud had survived its hardest examination under fluorescent lights. Outside, the town square was dry and bright after the storm. Clara stood beside her pickup, opened Amos's notebook on the hood, and drew one small checkmark beside his old sentence. The East Hollow is not a failed field. It is a slow water field. For the first time, the bank had been forced to read it too. News traveled faster than rainwater. By the next week, the jokes had changed shape. People still called Clara the duck girl, but the words no longer carried the same bite. Marlene at the diner put duck egg custard on the Sunday menu and sold out before noon. The bakery began advertising cakes made with local duck eggs from Whitmore Farm. Gardeners from town bought small bags of compost from the back of Clara's truck at the Saturday market. A restaurant 2 towns over called about seasonal duck for fall. But Clara did not mistake attention for safety. The bank had given her a bridge, not a rescue. Every month, she carried income sheets to Pike County Bank. Every week, she watched for disease, predators, feed waste, and water that sat too long without movement. She learned how fast a system could help a farm, and how fast it could punish carelessness. She improved the shelter design, rotated the birds more often, and began separating compost piles by age, so she could sell only what had cured properly. The East Field kept teaching. It taught her that too many birds in one spot made mud sour. It taught her that water had to slow, not stop. It taught her that reeds along the edge protected the soil better than bare banks. It taught her that profit was not one product, but a loop. Eggs paying for feed, ducks reducing weeds, bedding becoming compost, compost feeding vegetables, vegetables bringing customers, customers bringing enough cash to make the next payment. By September, Whitmore Farm looked different. Not polished, not rescued in the easy way people like to imagine rescue. The barn still wore patched tin like scars. The tractor still coughed blue smoke before it agreed to move. Clara still carried fence tools in the truck because something always leaned, snapped, sagged, or rusted through. But the East Field had become the place everyone watched. On a Saturday morning after the first cool front, Martin Alvarez brought a small group of farmers to the high edge of the hollow. Earl Benson came too, standing half a step behind the others with his cap low over his forehead. Harlan Pike arrived in a clean truck and stayed near the fence, careful not to get mud on his shoes. Clara did not give them a speech. She had built something better. 2 old doors from the broken machine shed stood upright on sawhorses near the field. Across the first door, she had painted a simple diagram in black. Old way. Rain came down. Water rushed out. Soil left. Fertilizer left. Money left. Debt stayed. The drawing showed a straight ditch cutting through a field like a wound. On the second door, she had painted another diagram. Whitmore Way. Rain came down. Water slowed. Ducks fed. Eggs sold. Mud composted. Soil deepened. Debt shrank. The drawing showed the East Hollow as a shallow bowl, with ducks moving across it, arrows circling from water to birds, from birds to compost, from compost to vegetables, from vegetables and eggs, back to the farmhouse. Between the 2 doors sat a galvanized bucket, filled with black compost from the duck shelters. Beside it was a basket of duck eggs, a crate of tomatoes from the barn garden, and the latest stamped receipt from Pike County Bank, sealed in a plastic sleeve so the morning dew would not soften the paper. No one laughed. The silence carried more weight than praise. Clara stepped down into the field and opened the gate. The ducks came through in a rush of white, brown, and speckled bodies, spilling into the shallow water. Their feet broke the gold reflection of the sky. Their bills disappeared beneath the surface. The mud stirred, not violently, not wastefully, but like something being mixed back into life. Daniel Whitmore watched from the porch in his chair, a blanket over his knees, and Amos's notebook resting open beside him. From that distance, he could not hear whatever the visitors were saying, but he could see them standing still. He could see Harlan Pike looking at the two painted doors. He could see Earl Benson standing at the back with his arms folded, trying not to look as interested as he was. Earl did not kneel by the compost bucket at first. He stood behind the others with his mouth set in the same hard line Clara had seen from across the fence all spring. While Martin Alvarez studied the water channels and the younger farmers asked about egg counts, Earl kept his eyes on the two painted doors as if he were looking for the trick in them. Old way. Whitmore way. The words bothered him. Clara could see it in the way his jaw worked. For 40 years, Earl had fought wet ground the only way he knew how. Dig deeper, pump harder, spray cleaner, plant sooner, blame the season when the land refused. The first painted door looked too much like his own farm after the flood. Water cutting through rows, fertilizer washed into ditches, diesel burned for nothing, debt sitting untouched at the end of it all. He shifted his weight and looked away. For a while, he pretended to study the fence. Then he walked to the edge of the hollow without asking permission. Clara watched him stop where the mud began. His boots stayed on the dry side. Pride held him there, as surely as any gate. The ducks moved through the shallow water below him, feeding in a loose line. One bird dipped its bill and came up with something small and dark. Another worked along a mat of weeds that would have cost Clara money to kill. The water did not rush. It settled. The field did not look conquered, but it did not look wasted either. Earl took off his cap and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. He glanced toward Clara, then toward Harlan Pike, then back to the bucket of compost sitting between the two painted doors. No one told him to touch it. No one made a show of waiting. That seemed to make it harder for him. Finally, as the others moved toward the garden beds, Earl stepped to the bucket. He reached in with 2 fingers first, cautious, almost dismissive, as if he expected the compost to be slimy or sour. Then he took a full handful. The dark material crumbled slowly in his palm. It held moisture without dripping. It smelled of earth, straw, and something clean beneath it. Earl rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, and the look on his face changed before he could hide it. Not admiration. Recognition. He knew good soil. No amount of pride could make him unknow what his hand was telling him. Still, he did not praise her. Not then. He let the compost fall back into the bucket, grain by grain. He brushed his palm against his jeans, put his cap back on, and stared toward the east hollow. For the first time since Clara had known him, Earl Benson looked less like a man waiting to buy her failure and more like a farmer standing in front of a lesson he did not want to need. When he finally came to her later, away from the group and low enough that no one else could hear, he did not ask for help directly. His pride would not bend that far in public. He only said that the low corner of his north field had stayed sour since the flood. Clara understood what it cost him to say even that. She did not smile. She did not remind him of the jokes, the slow truck rides, the way he had measured her land like it was already his. She only looked toward the hollow, then pointed to the shallow channels, the resting zones, the shelter placement, and the places where water needed to be slowed instead of forced out. Earl listened with his eyes narrowed, still fighting the lesson, still fighting himself. But he listened. By late fall, the East Field had become the farm's biggest profit center. The phrase sounded strange even to Clara. For most of her life, that field had been a problem, a family argument, a wet scar on the balance sheet. Now it carried the farm through the season. It did not do it by becoming something else. It did it by becoming more fully what it had always been: a low place, a wet place, a place that caught water, grew insects, held silt, fed birds, made fertility, and asked for a farmer who could see value where others saw failure. The diner increased its weekly order. The bakery paid in advance for holiday cakes. The restaurant took its first delivery of seasonal duck and placed another order for spring. Gardeners drove out on Saturday mornings to buy compost from the back of Clara's truck. The barn garden produced tomatoes, squash, and greens long after nearby gardens had burned out or washed thin. Whitmore Farm was not rich, but it was paying. At the end of harvest season, Clara made the largest payment Whitmore Farm had made to the bank since before her father's stroke. She drove home afterward without turning on the radio. The afternoon sun lay warm over the road. Dust rose behind the truck. In the passenger seat sat a stamped receipt and a small bag of pastries the bakery owner had sent home with her, made from her own duck eggs. Near sunset, after the visitors left and the truck stopped raising dust on Whitmore Road, Clara carried the two painted doors back to the barn. The words Old Way and Whitmore Way were still wet at the edges where the morning dew had touched the paint. The receipt from Pike County Bank stayed on the porch table beside Amos's notebook. Daniel sat in his chair with a blanket over his knees. His weak hand rested on the open page where Amos had drawn the slow water field. Clara placed a small handful of black compost in an old saucer beside him, and for a while neither of them moved. The farm was quiet, except for the ducks murmuring in the hollow and the soft ticking of the porch boards cooling after a warm day. Then Clara looked down the lane. The daffodils were not blooming anymore. Their season had passed months ago. Only thin green straps remained near the fence posts, half hidden by grass and dust. But Clara could still see them as they had been in March, yellow against the cold ground, rising from bulbs her mother had buried years before anyone needed proof that buried things could return. Behind her was her grandfather's page. Beside her was her father's hand. Down the lane was her mother's quiet line of flowers, waiting under the soil for another spring. Clara walked to the edge of the east hollow and crouched beside the water. The ducks moved through the gold reflection of the sky, breaking it into small ripples. She pressed her fingers into the mud and lifted a handful. It held together, dark, heavy, alive. On the porch, Daniel's hand stayed on Amos's notebook. Along the lane, the daffodil leaves moved softly in the evening wind. And in the field everyone once called lost, the mud shone like something remembered.